Today we're going to be learning about HTTP requests and webhooks, and these are both ways that you can connect your AI agents to third-party tools and services. We talked about last week how we have, hundreds of blocks available, and many of those blocks are direct integrations to services. We are slowly building up that library, but for everything else, you can use an HTTP request to tap into that service or tool directly. This week, we're going to explore how to use the HTTP request block. And then I'm also going to show you how to use webhooks. So this is kind of what we're going to be talking through today. What are HTTP requests? How do they work? How do we use them in MindStudio? We're going to do some very simple HTTP requests. And then what are webhooks? How do those work? And let's build an agent that is triggered via a webhook. And then we'll open up the floor for questions. And as always, just as a quick reminder, we'll be doing little check-ins. So just make sure you do thumbs up, thumbs down. I don't know. Feel free to use the raise hand feature, which I think is under, do we see that under reactions? I actually don't um, see that here. Can you guys see the raise hand tool, or
It's under
is that,
React.
it's under React. Okay. So if you should be able to see it under React. Thank you so much. And then also feel free, we have other folks from MindStudio here. Lewis is here, and he can help answer some questions in the chat. And I think Jerry's here, and I think Josh might be joining as well. So all folks uh, are here ready to answer questions if you have them in the chat. And also I may pause to see if there's any questions from folks during our pauses here. So you guys ready to dive in? HTTP requests, it's a lot simpler than it looks once you understand it. It can feel a bit overwhelming. But let's quickly review what an HTTP request even is. So the best I'm gonna give a super simple explanation, which is when you visit a website, your computer talks to another computer and they use this set of rules called HTTP. This is short for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. You don't need to know that. Normally it's just called HTTP, but it's just a fun tidbit of information. Same thing with API. I'll tell you what API stands for as well. We don't need to know, we're not testing you on all this stuff. It's just fun. And an HTTP request is kind of like sending, a letter or a request to a server asking for something. So some examples, when you go to google.com, you're sending an HTTP request. That URL is an HTTP request. It says, please give me the homepage of google.com. Or, please save this photo I uploaded to iCloud. Or please show me the weather in New York, right? These are all examples of things that you can do on the web that are facilitated via, HTTP requests. And everything on the internet kind of works in this way. There are four kinds. Really, there are more. There are two kinds of requests that you'll be using most frequently. There's the GET request, which simply asks for data from a website, and we'll look at what a request looks like in just a second. But this is the simplest kind of request. It's just one URL with some parameters. We'll talk about query parameters in a second, but basically pointing to the endpoint, which we talked about last week, that URL plus what specific information do you want. And then there's the post request, which is sending data to that service and then getting data back from that service. And all of these methods will be listed in documentation pages. So they're really easy to understand what type of method you need to use when using the HTTP request block. There's a couple of more types of requests, but we're not going to really dive into those. We're really going to be focused on get and post in this session here. So we also should really quickly cover the anatomy of an HTTP request. And we kind of touched upon this in the part one session, but I thought it'd be useful to break it down. There's essentially three parts. There's the URL, which is often referred to as the endpoint. There is the method, and then there are headers and body. And headers are kind of like, if we're going with this writing a letter analogy, it's kind of like the the details that go on the front of a letter, like the address and the recipient, and usually you'd include something like a format type, like I want to receive this in JSON format, right? That all kind of goes inside the header, and then the body, also sometimes referred to as the payload, is the actual message or data that's being sent back and forth between your computer and the other computer. These two, servers in a sense, right? Um, and so this is not what an HTTP request actually looks like, but it's like a very simplified version, just using plain English with a fake URL, right? So we're trying to get the current weather data. Um, we would send this to the endpoint, which is api.weather.com, which is just a fake website I made up. I don't know if it actually exists. Um, there is the type get, and then we want to get that information back in JSON. Um, so the other thing that we refer to when using HTTP requests is we typically say if it has an API, you can send an HTTP request to it, right? And what that means is that the company or service that you're looking to connect to has created this thing called an API, and it stands for Application Programming Interface. It's basically a system on their end that allows your computer to communicate programmatically to that particular service. Um, and the way that we talk to these services is via HTTP requests. So if a company does not have an API, they have intentionally said, we don't want to allow an external computer to communicate with our system programmatically, right? Um, APIs typically are formatted like a menu, quote unquote menu, because it has a list of different endpoints that you can connect to do different things. And so there are many different kinds of APIs. These are like some simple examples. Whoops. Like a weather API can get you the current temperature at your location, or a movie API can give you the name and title of a movie, or a payments API can process a credit card payment or something like that, right? So these are all examples of different APIs that different services might provide, right? Now, inside of MindStudio, the HTTP request block looks like this, right? If you open up the block, you'll see that we have those same pieces, the anatomy that we discussed a bit earlier in these slides, right? We have that endpoint URL, we have the method, we have the headers, and we have this thing called parameters, which we'll talk about in just a second. But it's essentially um, these strings that we attach to the end of the URL that specify what specifically what we're looking for. So if I was using a weather API, I would use a query parameter to give it my zip code or my city, so that it doesn't just get me the world's weather, it gets me the weather to my specific location, right? Um, and when you use the post method, you may also encounter this section called the body. And the body, or again, sometimes it's referred to as the payload, is typically JSON that you would send in order for the service that offers this API to like process in some way and then return another, some body back, right? It's just content. That's all it is. Um, Lastly, there's the output variable, and the output variable is where it's the MindStudio part. We save what comes back as a variable so that we can use it later in our workflows, right? So typically, so what I recommend is like there's a bunch of different kinds of free public APIs that are really good playgrounds, right? Like there's this thing called the cat API that'll just return an image, a random image of a cat. And it's like a really good way to practice sending an HTTP request and getting something back, right? Or this Ageify where you give it a name and it will just guess an age, right? There's really no rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes people use it in like research and things like that. But these are like free public APIs. I also recommend you start with these GET requests because they're just a little bit simpler. Um, it's really just one URL. Give it, including your API key, and it will return some information back to you. And then we'll look at how to uh, access the API's documentation and how to read it properly. And a lot of APIs also have these, playgrounds that will actually format the entire API request for you. And so, making sure you understand how to properly use this documentation is going to be really helpful in setting up your HTTP request block. So with that, let's look at, and we're going to look at a couple of examples of HTTP requests. And what we're going to look at two. The first is a GET request, and the other is a POST request. There is this API that is a weather API. Whoops. Um, and this weather API is completely free. If you go to the pricing page, they have like a free tier that gives you 1 million calls per month. They can do a number of different things. Really good API to just play around with. Um, and the way that it works is if we go to the actual API reference page, there's a couple of things that we should be paying attention to. One, and again, everybody sets their API up in a different way. And so knowing how to kind of navigate what to look for, it all goes back to these different parameters, right? The URL, the method, any headers, any additional parameters or body content that's required from that particular API. And if we look at this, I keep going to this, which is the tool, which I'll show you in a second. But if we just look at this API, they have, it's always important to look at kind of the getting started section, which basically gives you instructions on how to access the API. Says, okay, you need to sign up. They have a way to try the API using this API Explorer, which we'll look at in a second. They have, a bunch of other stuff, right? These are the other things. Authentication is protected via an API key, so we know we need an API key. And we will use this key parameter, right? This parameter is important because in order to get data back, we'll need to include that in as part of the endpoint, right? There's also the different types of requests that you can make. This is our menu, right? And in this case, it can give us the current weather. It can give us a forecast. There's a search. You can look at previous weather, a bunch of different things that we can do here. And then underneath are all of the different parameters. Now, in my opinion, uh, this one's not as clean as other documentation because this gives you all of the parameters. And then there's like this notes section. And so not all of these parameters are actually needed depending on the request you're making. And so it's really important that you kind of read through this, but it'll tell you like if I'm using, the key is always required and this queue parameter, which is the query parameter, is always required in these requests. And the query parameter can be any of these things as the query parameter. So I'm going to use this one that says you can use a US zip code as the query parameter. So let's go ahead and build an agent. And I'm going to go to my workspace. We'll click on Build New Agent. And what I'm going to do is simply add in the HTTP request block. We have our HTTP request block, and we're going to be using this GET request. And what we want to do is maybe make a 10-day weather forecast, right? We want to forecast the weather for the next 10 days. So what we're going to do is use the base URL. This is our endpoint. And then in this case, to select the method, we will actually add one of these things to the endpoint. So in this case, we'll add forecast.json. And a lot of these things will, a lot of documentation will also provide this playground where it says try our weather API. If we click on this API Explorer, we'll actually go to this interface that allows us to essentially set everything up for us. So I'm going to go ahead and let me go to my account. I will copy in my API key. So here's my API key. We are using the HTTP protocol. We want our format to come back, be returned as JSON. And then I'm going to include my parameter, which is the required parameter Q. And this is my zip code. So see, it has a description. This is like US zip code, UK postcode, Canada postal code, IP address, longitude and latitude, or city name, right? And we can explore all of these things uh, down here in the request parameters section. It kind of explains all of these different parameters. The other thing that we need, and you'll see, oops, looks like somebody drew on the screen here. There we go. The other thing is you'll see that some of these are required with different methods, right? So this days, which asks for the number of days you want forecasted, is required for the forecast API, which is the one that we're going to be using. So you can see here all the different APIs. It shows you the required or optional parameters, right? So days is required, this air quality data is not required, and this weather alerts data is not required. And then if we click show response, it will give us the actual endpoint, right? This is the thing all set up for us. And we can click this and make a copy. And then inside of our HTTP request, we can simply include that as our URL, right? And that's super simple, right? It sets everything up for us. We don't need to include any headers or any additional parameters. And we'll save this as, a variable that I'm going to call weather API, right? Now let's just run this and we will display weather API and see what we get back, right? So I'm going to open up the draft preview. And you'll see here, this is the information that we get back. We get, uh, based off of my zip code, it knows I'm in Redlands, California. We have the current weather, and then we have the forecast. So for the next, 10 days, right? It gives us all of this information about the weather, and you can see that this is all structured using JSON, which we've all learned via these various boot camps and videos and things like that. So we know that we get different pieces of data back, including this forecast day, which gives us an array of each day for the next 10 days. We can use this information in various ways. Maybe we want to, instead of, now that we know that the HTTP request is working, maybe we can have it just display a 10-day forecast for us, right? So I can put in, some a tag called weather data. Let's close the tag, weather data, and we'll put in our weather API response here. And we can say based on weather data, generate a 10-day forecast, be as detailed as possible, right? Or we could give it other instructions, but let's just see what this generates, right? So we're going to go ahead and open up the draft agent one more time. And so now what it's going to do is it's going to take that response from the API, that weather API that we sent a request to, and it's going to format it nicely for us, right? So here's the 10-day forecast. I asked it to be as detailed as possible. So it gave us, you know, the hour by hour forecast for every day for the next 10 days, right? Um, Along with the summary of each the average temperature for each day, current weather conditions, location, the current time, all that stuff, right? Now let's maybe we can make this output a table, you know, to show the forecast. We can format this in a number of different ways. Ask it to based on how we prompt it. But now the important part is that we have all of that data now that we can work with. And so you can create all sorts of things like this 10-day forecast. Looks like we're not getting any rain here in my city this week. And uh, that's super cool. We tapped into a completely third-party service that wasn't integrated into MindStudio. We were able to get data from that service, and we did it all, for free via this API that's offered for free. And there's a bunch of APIs that are completely free that you can tap into. Just, be careful as you're browsing the web looking for APIs. And typically like the safest and simplest APIs to start with are these GET requests, right? Because you're not actually sending data to that particular API. You're only receiving data from that service. Um, Now let's assume that we wanted to make this value dynamic. So I don't always want to get the weather from my city, you know, every time. Well, the way that we can create this HTTP request, there's a couple of ways. One is we can ask AI to generate it for us, which has its pros and cons, right? It's able to parse fuzzy information and turn it into something that we can use as our URL for our HTTP request. But there's a lot of variability, and if you're not able to fine tune it well enough, you might be sending a request and not getting any data back because that URL is wrong. For something like this that's so simple, what we can do is have a user input, right, where we ask or assume this is data coming in from somewhere that we're going to be passing through. And in this case, I'm going to ask for a couple of things. I'm going to ask for the zip code. And we'll make this short text. And then, actually, I think that's all we need for now. Oh, maybe we want something like number of days, right? That would be a good one. And we'll call this days, right? How many days would you like to forecast? And maybe we can have let's actually do a text choice here. And we'll say one, or let's do 3-day forecast, 5-day forecast, and 10-day forecast. Okay. And let's fix that typo. Okay. So we'll add these two things. And what we want to do is we can use variables in our URL here, But what I like to do is actually use a display content block and write out the uh, write out the actual HTTP request. And what I might do so that I can, uh, so you can see here, we have our full URL here. And after the question mark, these are those parameters that we talked about, right? So let me zoom in a little bit so we can all see. So if we separated this question mark, we're not going to do this for real, but these are separated as different key value pairs, right? And so you can see that all of these are key value pairs. For each new key value pair, we separate it in the URL via this and ampersand, right? These are called query parameters, and once you know what these are, you're going to start seeing them everywhere when you go to websites. So like a lot of for those of you familiar with um, marketing, right? These are very similar to UTM tags that you'd add, where those are all just query parameters, right? It's the same thing where you're adding source, email, you know, customer type, uh, new, whatever you're adding to your UTMs. These are just different types of query parameters that are specified via the API, right? Um, 1 second. You just clear the drawings. Thank you. And all these get attached via this ampersand, right? So it's super simple, and it's everything that like you'll basically have your endpoint, and then you'll add this question mark here, and then you'll add each individual query parameter, right? That's required. Vidal, would you mind not drawing on the screen? Thank you. I can see you drawing on the screen. We please refrain from drawing on the screen. Thank you. Um, okay. So let's put this all together. We want our this query is going to be our zip code or our postal code, which I called zip. So we're gonna, instead of using a zip, we're gonna include our zip um, variable. And then for our days, we're gonna include our days variable, right? And then we can just put it all together, right? So we can add all of these back in here. And now we've got, whoops. Now we've got our full URL. And we can save this called and call it like API, URL or whatever we want to call it. Right? So now we can use this in our main flow. And instead of using our regular URL, we will use this variable called API URL that we saved in the previous step. So let's go ahead and let's look up. Does anybody want to volunteer their zip code in the chat here, or their postal code? And we can try out a new postal code. Let's open this up one more time. Oop, 1 second. Let me adjust my screen really quick. There we go. Okay. All right, Sebastian, I see you posted yours. We're gonna go with yours. 90210 Beverly Hills. Nice. Let's go actually with 90210. Uh, okay, let's open this up. In the draft agent, it's going to ask us for our zip code and how many days we'd like to forecast. Let's put 5, and let's see what happens here. So it sent the API request. It got some temperature back or some based on the weather data. Here's the 4-day forecast. The provided data only contains 4 days, right? So we only got 4 days back. But here you can see the um, provided table for the weather forecast for the next 4 days. So nice, that worked. We'll try a different one. Let's do this one more time and see what happens. This is, I think, a not a zip code, but a different postal code I saw from Karen. And let's see what happens. I think this should also, is this a UK postal code? Okay, great. I think if we looked at the uh, UK postcode, nice. So that's also a valid postal code, which should work. It's raining a lot. Let's see if it's accurate. There we go. 5 days. There we go. Yeah, it indeed is. And it's gonna rain for the next looks like the next 3 days, and then it'll be sunny, hopefully again.
Great.
Um, Doug, I see your hands raised.
Yep. Can you talk about the difference between this process of accessing the API with a heavily structured query with parameters versus what you might expect just getting back a regular chat-based query from a large language model? Uh, because it seems to me that this is exactly what a large language model would do also if you just ask for it. Or am I
Yeah,
just
that's
crazy?
true, right? So if I went to so this is just a simple sample. If I said tell me the
Okay.
weather for the next 5 days, you're saying what's the difference between what we just did and this right here?
Just curious if it's like, I realize your example is good for training purposes and it's simple. I was just wondering if there's a,
Well, let's see what happens, right? So it has access, ChatGPT does have access to a weather API, and that's where it pulled this information. It knows my IP address because
mhm.
of where I'm signed in, and it is able to do this. But let's now that we understand kind of this type of HTTP request, let's look at something a little more complex because this is actually where I was headed, right? Like, yes, you could totally do this, right? For this type of app, not super useful. But let's see, let's do a new chat, and in this case, we're going to be using Apollo to enrich a contact, right? ChatGPT can't do that. ChatGPT doesn't know who I am, right? If even if
Right.
I gave it my LinkedIn my LinkedIn profile, it would not know. It would not be able to get me find my email, right?
Thank you,
Um,
Lewis.
yeah, no worries. Yeah, you're making a great point, Doug. Like this is just the simple, fun example. Let's get into the real world example. Um, so I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this. We'll call the top one, weather, and we'll call the new one um, enrich contact. And inside of enrich contact, maybe we set this as the entry flow since that's the one we're testing. And let's go ahead and just delete all of this stuff again. Here we go. We don't need this, but we do want our display content block so that we can see what we get back. Now, weather dashboards aside, that was great, but let's say we want to enrich a contact. Well, if we look at the Apollo documentation, there's this thing called reference docs, and this is a much more structured and much deeper API than the weather API, right? It can feel a bit overwhelming, and each API uh, endpoint has a different methods. Each method has different query parameters, and so the way we set something like this up is we always will start with you know, by looking at either authentication or sometimes in the get started section, there is a like a tutorial to help us get started. If you're new to Apollo, you need to get started with an account and you need to create an API key. Um, and so in order to create an API key, yes, that's all. I see your question, Karen. Like for services, there are some services that are free and there are some services that are not. We already have an Apollo, a connection to Apollo that's being used in some of our blocks. And so that's how I have access to an API key. But if you were wanting to connect to a service like Apollo to do a people search and enrich contacts, you would need to subscribe to Apollo and then create your own API key. And that's kind of the point of the HTTP request is like if it's not available, if it's not integrated on MindStudio yet, you can still access it if you have the right if you have like a subscription to these services or whatever you're using. Okay, so we need to create an API key. And so the way that we do that is let's go. There's all these links, right? A lot of this is just hunting down the right piece of information. So if you're a customer that wants to access Apollo's data, I'm going to go to create API key. And you'll see we get to launch Apollo and go to settings, dot integrations. It'll give us this section called API keys. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go to settings, integrations. And then let's see if we can find API, programmatically access Apollo's functions. You can also, they sometimes have a development platform. So if you go to, I found it by signing up for their API, and you get this like API management screen, which is different from the Apollo screen, right? And so go ahead and delete this. Typically, you'll get to this page, you'll find this page called API keys, and you will create a new key. And you want to name your key. The other thing that's important is you don't want to expose your keys. I'm doing it for the purposes of this demo, but I'm going to delete it right after the demo's done, right? And there are, it'll also ask you to select like choose your dish from the menu, going back to our menu analogy. This is the full list of API endpoints that we can access, and we kind of covered this on the part one, but you want to make sure that you are accessing the correct endpoint. So if we look at the documentation and look at the endpoint, the URL, it's posted at the top. It gives us the method and the URL right off the bat. And so we know that this URL is slash people slash v1 slash people slash match. And so when we create our API keys here, we'll look for, maybe I can just type in match. And you can see here we have slash v1 slash people slash match. We can select that one. And then we can create our API key. And now we have this API key that we can use. So now that that is set up, we can then go through and include, like go through their documentation and see what we can do with this particular endpoint, right? This uses people enrichment to enrich data for one person. It relies on information that you pass to the endpoint. And so we're going to need to pass information. We're going to need to send information to this API in order to get information back. And that's why it is not a get, but it's a post request, right? And then these are the pieces of information that we can send. Some of them are optional and some of them are required, and it will tell you which ones are required in order to actually use the endpoint. So in this case, all of these look like they are optional. But for example, if we are doing something like a people search, it will actually tell you, it'll tell you if it's required or not in order to run the the API request. Okay, let's not get sidetracked. Let's close out some of these windows. We have our documentation here. Unlike this weather API that we were tapping into, our tester is actually here on the right-hand side. And what they've done with this documentation is very similar. They have their query params that is specifically for this API endpoint, and we can simply put in the information that we want to send to that particular endpoint. So in this case, what I am sending is my first name, my last name, and my LinkedIn URL, right? And that's information that we can collect via a form, right? Somewhere. So here, what we're going to do on the right-hand side, there's kind of these two different ways of giving credentials. Bearer is typically used when you have what like for when you're using a thing called OAuth, which is like a sign-in method. Well, we'll say actually sign in to your account. And then this header method is what we're going to use when making like this very simple HTTP request to a service like this. And this is called is labeled via this thing called XAPI key. Can everybody see my screen here on the right-hand side now? And this is where we would put our API key. So I'm going to go ahead and copy my API key and paste it here. And you can see that now we get this new header that we need to include in our HTTP request, right? And as we fill out our query parameters, you'll notice that the URL is adding those query parameters to the end of this URL, right? And it's doing all of this for us, right? So let's go ahead and set up the block itself. Instead of API URL, we are going to simply copy this URL. There we go. The method is post. You'll see post has this body content, but we don't actually need that. What we do need to add are these headers. So you'll see here that we have a header called cache control. And what we're going to do is just, these are our key value pairs. And when you add headers, they appear also as key value pairs here on the right-hand side. So we'll enter the key and we'll enter the value. This is a key called cache control. Let's do that. This is a value called no cache. Let's add that. Next, we have content type. This content type is actually covered here. You can see it's like been abstracted into this form, so we don't need to include that. And then we have our accept. So we'll add accept. And then we have application JSON. And so this is essentially telling it we want our data returned back in a JSON format. And then the last thing that we need to include is our API key. So here's our X API key, which is the header we need to include. So we'll have X API key, and then our actual API key, which I'm going to delete after this webinar is over, because remember, again, it's bad practice. It's actually, very unsecure to expose API keys to anyone that you don't trust. So let's go ahead and send this, and we'll save this as enrich, or we'll save this as Apollo response. And we will display that in the display content block. Let's try this out and see what we get back. Now keep in mind that the query parameters are, right now, they're static, meaning this is just a one request here that we'll consistently make every time. I'll show you how to make that request dynamic in just a second without using that display content block. So let's go ahead and run this. Open the draft agent. Come on. Open the draft agent. There we go. And this is what we get back. It took my LinkedIn URL and it was able to get my first name, last name, my email status, verified, my actual email, my, you know, headline on my LinkedIn profile, the city that I live in, even though it doesn't really know the city I live in, but this is from my LinkedIn, along with like, departments, sub-departments, all these different things, right? It looks like it even pulled the photo from my LinkedIn, which is cool. So super cool, right? I am now an enriched contact. And so now that we know how this works, well, let me actually pause really quick. Is this making sense? Yeah. This is how most documentation works. There might be documentation that doesn't have this like nice tool here. And so in that case, you need to make sure that you're using query parameters differently, right? And I'll show you what that looks like in a second, right? Um, so let's assume that I want this to be dynamic, right? I don't want to always have the same static URL at the end here. And at the same time, I have a LinkedIn URL, and this has some like weird symbols that were automatically parsed for us, right? So we can't just put in the LinkedIn URL as is. It actually needs to be, encoded in order for this to make sense, right? What we'll actually do is utilize this parameters uh, section here, and this will actually include all of those query parameters. We can add those as key value pairs as well. So instead of this, we can just delete this, or maybe we want to have a display content block. Here we go, and let's just use this as like our little note taker. Remember, we have these query parameters, first name and last name and LinkedIn URL and reveal personal emails equals false and reveal phone numbers equals false, right? These are all different query parameters that we can add, right? And there are some restrictions as well. So if you're reading the documentation, like reveal phone numbers has additional requirements if you set it to true for it to work. Like it's all based on kind of the documentation as you continue reading. Um, so let's go ahead and set these query parameters up, right? We can do that in the exact same way inside of our HTTP request block. We have a parameter called, let's go back to our display content block. We have first name. So we'll slowly start adding these in. First name, and we're going to collect this information. So I'm going to assume that I have a variable called first name. And one password, get out of here. Okay, we don't need it. It's fine. There we go. Now we have value called last name and a query parameter called last name. We have a query parameter called LinkedIn URL. And you can find all of these in the same way just by scrolling down. It gives you the exact thing that you need to include in the query parameters. So if I scroll down to the bottom here, I can see that it needs to be LinkedIn URL with this underscore here, exactly like this, right? So let's go ahead and add that in. This one was last underscore name. Here we go. We have LinkedIn URL, and I'm going to put in LinkedIn. And I think that's all we had for now. So we've added these parameters in here. So now we actually don't need it. We don't need it here in the right hand, like in the URL. We can actually just delete it and just put the endpoint. And this actually helps us clean it up a whole lot and lets it be more dynamic, right? Some APIs will also have, instead of including these as parameters, it'll ask you to send body, right? And this is just a different way of sending the same data, but it'll ask you to send it in the form of JSON in a particular way, right? So you may encounter a situation where the parameters are actually included in the body and they'll look like, they'll look very similar. Like, but the only difference is it's key value pairs, right? First, whoops. It'll look more like this with all the same rules as JSON, right? Make sure that that stuff's in quotes. We don't, for this particular API request, we don't need to do that. We just need to include it in the parameters here. So now let's go ahead and make our user input form. And instead of days and zip, we'll create something called first name. And we'll type in first name here. Make this short text. Let's duplicate this, and we'll call this one last name. Extra T in there. And then we'll type in last name. And let's duplicate this. And we will call this one LinkedIn. And we'll put in LinkedIn URL. And we want to make sure that the validation is a URL here. So we have all of this set up. Let's make sure that our user input block has this last name and LinkedIn URL. And then we have no errors, so that's good. And now we can run this one more time. Would anyone like to try and volunteer first name, last name, LinkedIn? And see it, we'll see if it works. I'll run it one time with my I'll run it with my info while you guys type in, if you guys want to test out to see if we can enrich you as a contact from via Apollo. Let's go to my LinkedIn URL here. There we go. And we'll close ChatGPT. And so you can see here that we got back this. So here's what's interesting about this is, in this case, the LinkedIn URL was not parsed correctly, right? It wasn't able to actually parse that LinkedIn URL. And that's because we actually need to encode the URL. We actually have a block that does that.
A suggestion in the comments, just to double check it just in case.
Check the variable name. I written it as LinkedIn. Oh, you're right. There we go. So now it's matching. I think I had it not matching before, and then let's make sure that the parameter. Ah, you're right. Okay. So we actually don't need this generate text block. There we go. Yeah, good catch. Let's try this one more time. There we go. Okay, wow. It was just a little typo. Even I can go down the rabbit hole sometimes. So thank you for catching me in my mistake here. Okay. Phew. I thought I had missed something, and I was like so ready to like be like, uh-oh, like what's happening? That's awesome. Thank you guys. You guys are pros. I don't even know why I'm teaching this. You guys are already pros. Okay, so now we are successfully making these HTTP requests. This is how it works. You need to read the documentation. There's no way to do this without reading documentation. because otherwise you're just randomly putting in information. Um, things to pay attention to, just kind of recapping this section here. You always need a URL. You always need a method. Sometimes you'll need headers and body, and then we also have this parameters thing that allows you to put in these additional query parameters. And those parameters are always specified in the documentation here. So any questions about how the HTTP request block works? Um, I'm gonna pause here and then we're gonna dive into webhooks, which are also they're a little bit simpler than this, to be honest. So I wanted to get this out of the way. Is this making sense? Yeah? Okay. As you go through this, I encourage you to try out some simple APIs. If you're interested in diving deeper and going, trying to find a service that we don't have that has a more in-depth API like this and try using it, we're happy to help you along the way to make sure that it's working. But this is how you connect to third-party tools and services that are not available. And you may need to, fiddle around with it a little bit. Like ChatGPT is your friend in this case, or use a chat agent available on MindStudio. Give it the documentation information, and it can help you, just give it the contextual information it needs, and it can help you kind of format all these things along the way. So let's move on to webhooks. And okay, webhooks are very similar to HTTP requests because they, in a sense, are an HTTP request, but it's kind of like an automated HTTP request that happens on other services, right? So my analogy for this, and it may or may not make sense to some folks, but let's say we make an HTTP request to Domino's Pizza. We we order the pizza. That's our endpoint. Pepperoni is our endpoint, right? Domino's then does some work, and then there is this webhook like that fires off when an event happens. And in this case, it's sends a text message back to us saying, you know, your order's ready, right? That's kind of how these things work. Um, it's an automatic HTTP request. This stuff's not really super important to know. What's more important is how this works in MindStudio. Um, and the way that these webhooks works is you are given a URL, which is your endpoint to a particular, service. Um, that service, like we generate an endpoint in your agent, that service is going to have some sort of automation in it. And it's going to say, oh, what do you want to do after this event happens? They're going to say, um, fire a webhook. And that fire webhook is going to point back to the URL that's generated inside of your agent. We'll show you what that looks like for real in just a second. And then what that does is that endpoint actually triggers a workflow, like an AI agent workflow with some data, these parameters that we were talking about. So this is what it looks like in MindStudio. The trigger run mode is webhook, and you get this URL that you can use inside of other platforms in order to like trigger an agent remotely from another service. This is used, I'm going to show you how it works inside of Notion, but it works very similarly in a bunch of different automation platforms. And so this URL is not editable, you actually just copy it and use it in that service that you're trying to connect to. So that's it. Like that's all you need to know about how webhooks work. Let's take a look and build something, and I'll show you a kind of a practical use case for this. So I have a form here, and actually maybe I will update this form. Oh, here we go, LinkedIn. Let's refresh this page. That collects the same information. LinkedIn, first name, last name, company website, and we're gonna submit this form, right? So I'm gonna put in my LinkedIn, my first name, my last name, and I can put in my company website. And we know what the company website is, but it's easier to copy and to paste it. Okay, this is now saved into my Notion database. So this is a database I created inside of Notion. Every time we get a new response, let me just clean this up a little bit. I had some other things that made this more confusing, so we don't need any of this stuff. So this creates a new entry inside of my Notion database. What we can do inside of Notion, I'm just working inside of a Notion page. They have this little tool called Create and View Automations, right? This is a super useful tool because you can say when a new page is added, I want you to do something, right? That's an event that's happening inside of Notion. And what are we going to do? We are going to send a webhook, right? Now, when we send the webhook, it's going to ask us, what's the webhook URL? So inside of our agent that we are going to build here, let's actually go back to our other agent here, and we'll have another workflow. We're going to call this workflow webhook. We will set our start block from on demand to webhook, and that gives us the URL. And what this URL does is it triggers this workflow that we're going to run. So inside of our Notion automation, we will put that URL in. Then it's going to say, what information do you want to send? And we're going to, in this case, you'll show the properties that you're going to send. The properties are just those columns, those cells inside of Notion, right? So we're going to give it all of the properties. That's it. We enabled that automation. So now when we go to a MindStudio workflow, when we enter a new response, right? That agent is going to kick off a new run and then process that data and do something with it. So I'll show you a practical example, and we'll see if I can find an example of something that with some past runs. Let's see here. I think it might be under my account. No, that's not it. I think it's this lead qualifier agent. So this is a webhook agent that we have set up that helps us quickly qualify contacts. What happens, and if we look at yeah, it looks like this is something that happened a few days ago. So I'll report this. Basically, what this does, if we look at a previous interaction, we get this thing called webhook params. And inside of webhook params, we get all of this data, right? Like people fill out a form, and we get all of this stuff back, right? And in particular, this is coming from Notion. We get this properties, this thing called properties inside of the webhook param. So that opens up, gives us, contact name, reason for contacting. It's part of our intake form, and it's a way that we actually leverage webhooks inside of MindStudio. This goes through and then takes that information and extracts values that we can actually use from that JSON, so that we can simplify our data. And then it does a couple of things. It will scrape a URL of the person. If there's LinkedIn info, it will also scrape LinkedIn info. And then it does deep research on that person. We essentially get we fetch the page from Notion so that we can pull other information. And then we set up and format a message for Slack. So basically, every time somebody has like a contact form for us, we will go through, have AI do deep research on that person, and then it will Slack us a summary of that person who reached out to contact us so that we kind of know who we're talking to when we reach back out to them. So yeah, maybe we'll end it a little early today. Um, just keep in mind, next Wednesday, same time, same place, I'm going to be talking about embedding agents on websites. Maybe I'll share a little quick preview of that, but basically there's a couple of ways to embed your AI agents that we're going to look at. Embedding is locked to the unlimited plan for now, but I'm going to showcase it regardless. Many folks that are on, I think, special bootcamp plan can also access this. So it's still really an important skill to have. And let me switch my workspaces really quick because I think I have access to it here. There's basically two ways to embed agents. One is a simple iframe, which we'll work through, and then the other is this thing called signed URLs, which basically allows you to attach your own usernames to AI agent runs. And so that's where we're going to be spending most of our time. But if you are interested in joining that, or if you know anyone that's interested in joining that, please, you can find that on our Luma events calendar, and it will be happening next week. I'll
I
go
also
ahead and
dropped
share
the
that.
link in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, but feel free to do it as well. More the merrier.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, subscribe to the calendar. We're gonna post more events. You get notified when things are happening. Like tomorrow, we're doing an event in partnership with HubSpot, where we're going to be demoing an agent that you basically type in your ICP, it goes and searches for contacts, enriches them, and adds them directly into your HubSpot CRM. So super cool. We've got more community events, so definitely be on the lookout. It's even if you don't come to the event, they're all recorded, so you can still register for an event and get the recording afterwards. Just a good way to keep in touch and know when things are happening. So, well, let's end it here. Let's end a little early. Thank you all so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day, and there will be a survey kind of toward that'll be sent to you guys if you guys wouldn't mind. I'm starting to collect feedback on these sessions, so just let me know your thoughts on how this went. If there's something new you want to learn, you can include anything you want in there. And yeah, that's it. Thanks so much. See ya.